Thank you. Well, I'm very happy to be contributing to this panel. I can already see lots of connections with Jennifer's and Ozzy's paper, and I'm sure there will be a lot to talk about. In September 1906, Virginia, Vanessa, Toby and Adrian Stephen, along with Violet Dickinson, travelled to Greece and then on to Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was then known, in the west. Watching the sun go down over the rooftops, the 24-year-old Virginia Stephen recorded her response. From this position you see over the town, or as much of it as a square window will compass, and that is enough to give you the sense that Constantinople is, to begin with, a very large town. Remembering Athens, you felt yourself to begin with in a metropolis, a place where life was being lived successfully, and that did seem strange, and if I have time to say so, a little uncomfortable. For you also realized that life was not lived after the European pattern, that it was not even a debased copy of Paris or Berlin or London, and that, you thought, was the ambition of towns which could not be Paris or any of those inner capitals. As the lights came out in clusters all over the land and the water was busy with lamps, you knew yourself to be the spectator of a vigorous drama, acting itself out with no thought of certain great countries yonder to the west. And in all this opulence there was something ominous and something ignominious for an English lady at her bedroom window. Here the spectacle of Constantinople, then a thriving commercial hub within the Ottoman Empire, situated on the boundary between Europe and Asia, seems to present something of a cognitive aporia, undermining a hitherto settled sense of the geopolitical map of Europe, and even of class and nationality. Why so? The city, Wolf writes, is not after the European pattern, not even a debased copy of Paris or Berlin or London, not aspiring to be one of those inner capitals, yet offering the vigorous drama of an urbanity every bit as cosmopolitan, if not more so, than theirs. She compares Constantinople favourably with Athens, the previous stop on the Stevens' tour of southeastern Europe, which she identifies as not a metropolis. Athens is not a metropolis, not, in her phrase, a place where life was being lived successfully. In the Aegean, then, relations between empire, nation-state, and capital city seem to occupy puzzlingly illegible configurations. They confound the moralized temporal schemata of backwardness and progress, mapped onto spatial positions in a global order, which Woolf carries with her as a citizen of the British Empire. Constantinople for Woolf would seem to form a juncture where modernity's own process of self-confirmation as a narrative of universal progress under the auspices of the West comes to a halt. Its polyethnicity mimics West European cosmopolitanism, yet doesn't conform to the regime of the modern West European nation-state. A few pages later in the travel diary, this conundrum leads her to despair that, quote, "When we come to consider the question of the West and the East, then indeed we lay down the pen and write no more." This bewilderment testifies to an implicit awareness of southeastern Europe as one of Europe's peripheries, seemingly left behind in the unprecedented industrial and economic acceleration of the Anglo-West European sphere in the last third of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, yet incubating new insurgent nationalisms which would funnel to an explosive point in Sarajevo on 28th of June 1914. Scrolling forward to the early 1920s, the moment of Woolf's earliest and most famous experiments with narrative temporality, notably Jacob's Room and Mrs. Dalloway, we find this particular periphery a flashpoint of renewed military conflict after the ostensible end of the Great War, in which the cities of both Athens and Constantinople were caught up. So, what would it mean to attempt to think the disjunctive temporal aesthetics of modernism in geopolitical terms? If, as Benedict Anderson, Franco Moretti and others have argued, the evolution of realist fiction tracks the narrative of the nation-state, in what ways might the avant-garde's frontal attack on linear time, as the organizing principle of form, biography and historiography, take its cue from the zones of contested, fragile and often aggressively reasserted national sovereignty, produced by the collapse of empires and the redrawing of existing maps of Europe in the interwar period. In this paper, I will explore modernist temporality in terms of what I take to be a newly defamiliarized time of the nation, more specifically in terms of a clash of asynchronous national times, unleashed in the crucible of that conflict. These are questions which I see as bearing upon the spatial and temporal coordinates of interwar modernism more generally, but I won't say too much more about that here, except to say that when we look to the imperial rimlands, the frontier and contested regions of the Ottoman, Russian and Austrian empires, we find the nation-state paradigm as derived from the West running up against the high degree of social, linguistic and ethnic heterogeneity which characterized those polities. As we know, all too often, the vacuum was filled by the rise of virulently monoethnic nationalisms and new forms of biopolitical management of human diversity. In this paper, I will pay particular attention to the Balkans, modern Greece and the Aegean, which emerge in the writing of Woolf, as of a number of her contemporaries, as specific and highly charged geotemporal sites within modernism. Woolf's novels are very closely linked with critical commonplaces about the temporality of modernism. Viewed within a genealogy of feminized impressionism and Bergsonian time thinking, first posited by Wyndham Lewis, they are said to reject totalized notions of history for an organicized everyday of nature, contingency, or intersubjectivity. However, to view them simply in these terms is to neglect the complex hermeneutics of modernity as global event in her work, and her abiding interest in modernity as a category of historical totalization. I will argue that for Woolf, modern time is a concept bound up with the politics of a shifting set of spatial relations, linked to the history of European imperialism and the world market. As I said earlier on, it is formed dynamically in the clash between the time of empires and that of the small nations which came to the fore in the years immediately preceding and subsequent to the First World War. For Woolf, this geopolitical time emerges in tension with the atemporal horizon of a Greek aesthetic ideal, posited as a nostalgic return to origins. I am, of course, not the first to focus on Woolf's critique of the imperial state at the moment of crisis represented by the First World War and its aftermath. However, in discussing Woolf's relation to empire and coloniality, I'm concerned to avoid what I see as a pattern in modernist studies, the risk of reifying a notion of European identity as synonymous with empire. So Woolf arrives at a conception of modern time as differential and conjunctural. That's my thesis. And she does so through a confrontation between the anachronistic discourse of Romantic Hellenism and the peripheral or uneven modernity of Southeastern Europe. As many of you will already know, the relationship between Greek antiquity and modernity in Woolf's work forms a master trope which spans her entire output, from the 1906 travel diaries, which I quoted at the start of the paper, through to the use of the chorus in between the acts in 1939. Her ongoing study of ancient Greek language and literature has been documented. It's been seen as an attempt to claim an elite educational patrimony reserved to her male contemporaries. Her fiction, journals and essays provide a record of a remarkably powerful, if conflictual, identification with an idealized image of ancient Greece, one whose terms are subjected to an increasingly sophisticated autocritique, without, however, ever being quite abandoned. Okay, the early writings more than once entertain the Hellenist idea of a direct mental link between the ancients and the English. By the time of the 1925 essay on Not Knowing Greek, though, Woolf concludes that, quote, between this foreign people and ourselves, there is not only difference of race and tongue, but a tremendous breach of tradition. Best known, perhaps, is her sharp critique in Jacob's Room of late Victorian Hellenism as an ideological apparatus for the reproduction of class and gender prerogatives. In every instance, the autocritique I argue, is triggered by the recognition of a divergence between ancient and modern Greece. Of course, it would be a mistake to treat Hellenism as a stable concept, denoting as it does an always already retrospective category, infected with exemplarity and belatedness. Changing conceptions of the Greeks have mirrored changing conceptions of being modern. As Nietzsche scandalously demonstrated in The Birth of Tragedy, modernity defines itself against an idealized image of the classical past. More than this, one cannot speak of Hellenism without also speaking of Orientalism. The two form parallel intellectual processes, dating back to the 18th century, which marked out Western Europe as the site of civilization, in contradistinction not only to non-Europeans, the colonized world, but also to the eastern lands within Europe. And here there are links with Jennifer's paper. So if Eastern Europe was cognitively mapped by the Enlightenment as Europe's Orient, that is, between Europe and Asia, between civilization and barbarism, Greece, though itself a Slavic territory, was exempted from this mapping, modern Greeks being designated as the inheritors of classical Greece. Yet modern Greece was seen by European humanists as an abject, impoverished remnant of classical glories. So modern Greece becomes a symptom of the metageographical construct of the West, which, though a product of the second half of the 19th century, comes into particular focus as a reaction formation in the aftermath of the Great War, partly under the influence of the Russian Revolution. Now, I mentioned Woolf's travel diaries at the outset, and Woolf's disappointment with modern Greece is very clear in those diaries, which relate her visit to Athens, her many visits to the Acropolis and the Parthenon. They're saturated with the language of Romantic Hellenism. And her disappointment with modern Greece is most vivid when she discusses the drastic convergence between ancient and modern Greek languages. I don't think I have time to read all of this, but she is discussing the language of modern Greece. For the language they talk is divided from the language that some few of them can write, as widely as that again is divided from the speech of Plato. The spoken language, because it has not been fixed by grammar or spelling, twists itself afresh on each tongue. So you must look upon modern Greek as the impure dialect of a nation of peasants, just as you must look upon modern Greeks as a nation of mongrel element, and a rustic beside the classic speech of purebred races. After all, we are in Athens, but Athens means many more things than the Acropolis, and the Zionist plan is to separate the quick from the dead, the old from the new, so that the two images shall not vex each other. So I take some pains to put old Greece on my right hand and new Greece on my left hand, and nothing I say of the one shall apply to the other. Similarly, in the undated, posthumously published story Dialogue upon Mount Pentelicus, a group of English tourists visiting the marble quarries of Pentelicus is mockingly depicted as struggling to communicate with their Greek peasant guides and denouncing them as barbarians. So the fact that Greek words spoken on Greek soil were misunderstood by Greeks destroys at one blow the whole population of Greece, both men and women and children. At such a crisis, one word came aptly to their lips, a word that Sophocles might have spoken and that Plato would have sanctioned. They were barbarians. The spurious people was convicted, the dusky, garrulous race, loose of lip and unstable of purpose, who had parodied the speech and pilfered the name of the great for so long, was caught and convicted. So here we see the elements of the autocritique that I was mentioning earlier on, because the whole story is very comical, very ironic, and in an ironic twist, modern Greeks themselves become the casualties of the ancient Greek practice of identifying non-Greek speakers as barbarians. Reinhard Koselleck has pointed out that the terms Hellene and barbarian, in which Hellene defines barbarian negatively, constitute foundational counter-concepts in cultural history. Barbarians originally were those who could not speak Greek. They were named after the sound barbar, the sound of their unknown tongue to Greek ears. So Greeks thought of barbarians as aliens, stammerers, and the incoherent, which seems as good a definition of modernists as any. Jacob's Room, then, to come back to Jacob's Room, it was Woolf's first programmatically experimental novel, begun in January 1920, completed in October 1922. And it's often described as a response to the Great War. In Alex Verdling's phrase, a satiric elegy offering a retrospective anti-Bildungsroman of Jacob Flanders, who dies in the war and whose name makes his death synonymous with the losses of the Western Front. Writing in 1922, Woolf sets the novel in the years leading up to the outbreak of war in 1914, anatomizing the formation of the English officer class from the vantage point of 1914. As a modernist anti-Bildungsroman, it decisively rejects the progressive or developmental historical consciousness associated with 19th century realism. To critique the Bildungsroman is to contest what Bakhtin called the genre's, quote, image of man growing in national historical time. The First World War dealt a death blow, as Franco Moretti has argued, to a genre already moribund by the 1890s. So there is something anachronistic about Woolf's demolishing the Bildungsroman all over again in Jacob's Room. Now, anyone who has read Jacob's Room will be aware that what one might call Jacob's banal Hellenism and its unmasking as an ideological apparatus of male bourgeois subject formation is the chief means through which satire operates in the novel. Throughout the novel, in instances too numerous to mention, Jacob's sentimentalization of Greek antiquity marks his sense of class and imperialist entitlement. He boasts about his familiarity with Greek culture. He confidently claims the status of heir to Greek civilization. That is his term, Greek civilization, a key term in the novel. The satire is sharpened by repeated comparisons of Jacob himself to a Greek statue, and by aligning him with the British Museum and its institutional reification of the cultural past. So all of this is quite well-worn territory in the criticism. What I want to focus on, however, is the spatial projection of the novel's satire. The novel sends its doomed male protagonist just before he enlists on a parodic grand tour, which begins in London and ends in Constantinople. Jacob travels from England to France, Italy, and Greece, and he ends up in Constantinople, the boundary between Europe and Asia. So the novel's compass shifts eastward. When Jacob visits Greece, moreover, he finds Athens an, quote, incongruous assortment, unquote, in which modern and pre-modern exist alongside each other. It's a clash of different temporalities, and its metropolitan modernity strikes him as, quote, ramshackle, its national culture ersatz. Both Patras and the city at which he first arrives and Athens are described in these terms, and I won't read these passages, but it's worth focusing on the image of the tram in Patras, and the sense that the trams clanked, chimed, rang imperiously to get the donkeys out of the way, and one old woman who refused to budge beneath the windows. So Jacob's rejection of modern Greeks and modern Greece, and his bewilderment at modern Greece, echoes Woolf's own reaction in her travel diaries. As Woolf did, he makes repeated pilgrimages to the Acropolis, the ultimate signifier, and the Parthenon, the ultimate signifier of the purity, austerity, timelessness, and composure that make up the Greek myth. And Woolf makes a lot of comic capital out of his reverent attempts to access the Hellenicity of the Parthenon, because bathos is the note that is struck in most of the passages which depict Jacob visiting the Acropolis. So here we have that description of Athens as still quite capable of striking the young man as the oddest combination, the most incongruous assortment. Now it is suburban, now immortal. Now cheap continental jewellery is laid upon plush trays. Now the stately woman stands naked, save for a wave of drapery above the knee. No form can he set on his sensations as he strolls one blazing afternoon along the Parisian boulevard and skips out of the way of the royal landau, which, looking indescribably ramshackle, rattles along the pitted roadway, saluted by citizens of both sexes cheaply dressed in bowler hats and continental costumes. Though a shepherd in kilt, cap and gaiters very nearly drives his herd of goats between the royal wheels, and all the time the Acropolis surges into the air, raises itself above the town like a large immobile wave, with the yellow columns of the Parthenon firmly planted upon it. So in Jacob's Room, the discovery of Greece's peripheral or uneven modernity deconstructs classical conceptions of beauty founded upon proportion, symmetry, perfection, all the more effectively because it is the geographical site associated with this atemporal aesthetic. Jacob's visit to Greece activates a reality principle in the text, since the ethnic and linguistic difference of actually existing modern Greece and its status as an impoverished client state refutes the atemporal ideality of Hellenism. Evidently, the late Victorian Philhellenist tradition in which Jacob is steeped cannot engage the realities of modern Greece. However, the motif of the Greek myth, what Woolf calls the Greek myth, in Jacob's Room is not just a satire on male bourgeois socialization. It takes on a further cast in the light of a geopolitical arc in which the interests of most European powers were involved, beginning with the Balkan Wars in 1912 to 1913 and ending with the Greco-Turkish War of 1920 to 1922, with which the novel's composition coincides. So Jacob's obsolescence as a type lies in his boundedness within a singular national historical time, his Hellenist misrecognition of British national imperial identity as universal. As I said earlier, he constantly refers to the British as the inheritors of the Greeks. And while clearly functioning as a representative of national and gendered privilege, he also serves as a placeholder for a fading West European identity. It's not just that the war globalized British identity, but that Britain's vanguard nation status counted for much less in the post-Versailles moment, marked by the collapse of the classical European concert of sovereign powers and the opening up of a European prospect no longer legible within the binary opposition of a Hellenicized West and Orientalized East. So I think I need to wrap up fairly soon, and I'll just say, in terms of this geopolitical arc, I'm reading Jacob's Room not just in terms of the proleptic temporality of the pre-war, which is how it's commonly read, Jacob's ignorance of the fact that he is going to die in the First World War, but also in terms of what one might call the recursive temporality of the interwar, a temporality of emergency linked with a crisis in the spatial order of Europe, and with the unfinished business of a war which apparently ended in 1918. The Greco-Turkish War was the first war after the war to end all wars. And the collision of Greek and Turkish nationalisms, which created over 1 million refugees during the autumn of 1922, coincides, as I said earlier on, with the completion of Jacob's Room. So Greece's desire for nationalist aggrandizement is implicit in, it's hinted at, it's implicit in the description of Athens, for example, in the playing of the royal band in the square of the Constitution, the guns firing at Piraeus. Well, time is moving on. I was going to talk about cosmopolitanism and the League of Nations, but I think that will have to wait for another occasion. I was also going to say something about the implications of this revelation of Southeastern Europe's peripheral modernity for the experimental features of Jacob's Room, for its dislocation of linear narrative and its pluralizing of narrative perspective. So I think I'll end with that, if I may. Much has been written of the episodic structure, the cinematic shifts of perception in the novel, and one might see this in terms of a play of margin and periphery within the nation itself. The constant satirical cutting down to size of Jacob, the exteriorization of his consciousness, becomes part of what I see as the novel's project of rescaling, so that he becomes peripheral, in a sense, to the novel that elegizes his death. And I'm suggesting that we might see the ultimate referent of this relativizing or decentering movement as the decentering of European space in the aftermath of World War I. So in this paper, I've tried to draw attention to the spatially uneven, discrepant temporalities implicit in modernism's time consciousness. Woolf's shifting attachment to the anachronistic discourse of Hellenism leads her to recognize the temporal dynamic of modernism as profoundly cultural in nature, in the sense that it is dependent on constantly changing cognitive mappings of Europe. And I think that it's the site of many discoveries for Woolf, this attachment to ancient Greek. The discovery that the West is neither a geographical nor a transcendental category, but a geopolitical one. The discovery that the condition for the possibility of conceiving of history as linear and evolutionary is its relation to other spatially coexisting temporalities and histories. And perhaps finally that the terms of modernity's entanglement with Hellenism, though often clothed in the language of Kantian or cosmopolitan universal histories, could be seen as narrow, self-involved, and perhaps provincial.